Okay, we're back, and just to make sure my little computer's working. Great. Okay, so last we saw our heroes, we were doing this nifty attribute transfer thing, right? So now it comes magic time. As a matter of fact, to make this a little easier for you guys to see, I'm going to do this. I'm going to close pane, all tabs. I'm going to hit P, and just have like a little mini guy for the parameters up here. So the thing to remember, gives us a little more space. The thing to remember is that we're doing an attribute transfer, right? And right now you're like, oh, hey, that's cool. It's going to work. It's going to be awesome, which it is, except our question is right now, as you can see, it doesn't leave a trail. And the magic of this whole gag is how to leave a trail. So here's where we crack our knuckles and do some magic. First thing is, I tried several ways. Some ways using like particle systems and some other fancy stuff. Turns out there's the easiest way to do this is simply with the SOP solver, which you may have used once in a while. It turns out to be extremely handy. So the deal with the SOP solver is we're going to put in our our guys over here, which is our blue points, into our first input, and then our other input's going to come from the red. Now we're going to take this guy. Notice that he doesn't have local references or relative references. He has absolute references. That's awesome. And the reason is because we're going to cut him, and we're going to go inside the solver. I'm going to go back to frame 1. We're going to go inside the solver, and we're going to pop him down here. Now, inside the solver, here's where there's a lot of little things to do for the magic to happen. First thing is we want to, well, first place, let's show what's happening. This is our first input. Now, if you remember this, this is actually our original geo. And basically the points from the character. I guess original geo might not be the best name. But it's the geometry that we're going to transfer stuff to. This input 2 here, which by the way, you can see the little nifty name there. Memorize that in case you need it in the future. This guy is our all fluid points, remember? So we're doing the same thing we did up there. And right now you're like, okay, great, boring, what does that matter? Here's where it matters, this little guy. This guy previous frame, this is this guy from the previous frame. So what we want to do here is we want to say we're going to do the attribute transfer, which will transfer our attributes, specifically wetness and color, to our current points. But we also want to grab from this guy, whatever his wetness was, some amount of it. Not all of it, obviously, because then it would be wet forever. We're going to say like maybe 90% of it. So each frame it'll be a little bit less and a little bit less. So the way we're going to do that is with, probably used to using a VOP SOP. Houdini's actually changed that. So now we don't have VOP SOPs anymore. We have point VOPs and attribute VOPs and so forth. We're going to use an attribute VOP for this. So I'm going to lay that puppy down. On the first input is going to be our current frame stuff. So think of this as, I'll even call this X for wetness. Think of this as being our current frame of transferred wetness. And this, we can think of this as being what this guy was on the previous frame. So remembering that, this is going to be a guy to add some wetness from previous frame. I know that sounds silly to do that, but sometimes I think it's actually helpful to give really explicit stuff. We're also going to have some parameters that are going to pop in here, come into play. Okay, if you guys haven't made a VOP before, you probably have. Here's where the exciting stuff happens. I'm actually going to make this big because it's that exciting. So, what are we doing here? Our gag is multifold. First, we want to grab the wetness from our current guy and our previous guy. So we need to import an attribute. Now, in VOP SOPs in the past, there used to just be one import attribute. Now in Houdini 14, and by the way, make sure you have the latest version of Houdini 14, because if you have 14.0 point something or other, it actually didn't have these guys, and it threw me for a loop literally just 5 minutes ago when I was trying to do this lesson, and these guys weren't there. I had to download the most recent version. So we want to grab an import point attribute. This is going to be our wetness, which is current wetness. And so the way we're going to set this up is, fortunately, they now have these things, which are awesome. Coming from our first input, it's going to be a float. And I'm going to say this is wetness. So that's the name of the attribute. Now for the previous frame, it's just the same thing, but from the second input. And this guy I'm going to call previous wetness. I like capitalizing things once in a while. So what are we going to do with this? The gag is we're going to take our wetness here, and we're just going to add a little bit of this guy. How much? That's what we're going to leave up to the user, which of course is us. So I'm going to say, let's grab U here, and now we're going to multiply it, and we're going to middle click and say promote parameter. So, and by the way, another little handy dandy trick is if you click on this little dot there, then you can put the names in there for what these are called. I'm going to call this, this is basically our multiplication of the previous one. So I'm going to call this prev mult. Prev mult. Is the best idea? I don't know. I think probably a better, fancier name for that, but whoa, sorry, that's actually the address of where my mother's coming to stay here to visit me in Vancouver. I guess I had that in the copy paste thing. Okay, previous mult is going. This is going to mult it by the previous amount. I would say a default for this usually is like, you know, a lot of it, like 0.95. Basically, every frame is going to click, 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 click the first time 95%, then 95% of 95%, and so forth. So it goes down. And what we're going to do is we're going to add that with our current guy. So instead of just having our current wetness, we're going to have the previous wetness added to it. Now, you'd think we're done, wouldn't you? And we're just going to output our wetness. Let's actually pretend we are for a second, and I'm going to say why we're not quite done. What we're going to do is we're going to output that, which nowadays I'm going to use bind, and you give it the name of the parameter, the attribute that we're binding it to. We have to make sure we spell it correctly, which is going to be wetness, and we're going to say use this node to set parameter attributes, and we say when input is connected, and then bum, 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 then we have a little input to it. So that will actually bind it to wetness, and basically this is kind of our wetness output. You might think we're done. We're not. Why? Because we want, we have two kind of complex things happening here. We want it to be clamped. In other words, we want the idea is that it goes down to a minimum wetness. We don't want it to go all the way dry necessarily. In other words, we want to have the option of having it go all the way to 0, in which case it goes completely dry again. But usually in real world, things don't go totally dry, so we're going to give it a minimum. So let's actually put that through a clamp, and we'll just promote the parameters on min and max. And the min, we'll call, you know, min wetness. And the max wetness, you know something, the max wetness I think is always going to be 1. Let's not even put that. We're just going to leave that at 1. The min wetness, however, let's give that a default of like 0.2 or something. We'll find out what looks good later. Then we're going to put that as our wetness and our output. Now, wetness is cool, but the other thing I want to do is I want to be able to see it, like in a red-blue thing, and this is something I do a lot of. When you want to see something, just go ahead, take the attribute. This passes through and outputs it. Throw it into a color mix, and have the color mix do just a mixing from a bright one color to another. Like, let's say 0 wetness is blue and full wetness is red. Let's do that and throw that into the color. And we're almost done here, except the eagle-eyed among you is going to notice something. But it took me a while to be eagle-eyed. So see how purpley that looks? Let's go ahead and actually let that run for a second, and I'll show you what I mean. Our problem now is, there's a little reset simulation here. If you watch this, it's doing something. And you see it's leaving a trail. Oh, and the trail's even fading off. That's exciting. But this isn't blue. This is that minimum value. Why? Because we just simply clamped it. We don't want that. We want this to be completely dry because no wetness is hit there. We don't mind that where stuff hit at one point goes down only to that minimum stuff, but we want the dry parts that never got hit to stay dry. So here's where logic gets a little confusing. All we're going to do to make that happen, and this is probably not going to make sense to you initially, and you're going to have to kind of trust me on it, but we're going to do a compare, and we're going to compare the previous wetness. I'm going to pop it in there. I'm going to say if that is, I would say equal to, let's say less than or equal to that. And that we're going to pop into, oh, we're out of time. Don't worry, I'm going to finish this. Going to go a few seconds over. We're just going to put a switch in. Okay. The switch is going to control this, and this is going to go in between two things. Namely, it's going to go switch between our value we like, our clamp, and this guy. At this point, you're going, what? Our pre-clamped amount? Why would that be a thing? I hate lines crossing, by the way, in case you're wondering why I'm moving these guys around. I have a thing in my VOPs where I'm trying not to cross the streams. It's a Ghostbusters thing. So, non-crossing the streams, I don't even know if that's possible. That will actually be our final wetness. Yeah, it is possible. There you go. Look at that. Okay. So we're saying that if it's equal to 0, the previous wetness was 0, we're going to do the unclamped version instead of the clamped version. The clamped version, remember, goes to a minimum value. Now, that all sounds a little complex to me, so usually we just go through and look at it and see if we're a genius. The answer is we are. See how this is full blue? This is red, and this goes to purple. Why is that important? Not just because of that, because the next thing we're going to do is we're going to delete all the points that are dry, the completely dry points, because in the future, this might be a whole giant character in just a little space. So we're going to do that, but we're going to do that in the next lesson. So stay tuned, we'll do that.